We're entering into a new sermon series today that we're calling Meditations. The thing about meditation is that it requires a certain degree of stillness and focus that can be especially hard to come by these days. And so, in the spirit of this series and out of a recognition of a deep need that many of us have right now for just a little bit of calm and stillness amid the chaos that is our world right now, I'm going to ask that we take just a few seconds to still our minds and our souls into quiet presence, meditatively or prayerfully. So if you'd like to shut your eyes, breathe deeply, you may do so, but we're going to be in silence for a moment together. Join me now. Amen. Thank you for doing that with me. I think it's really important because it is in and through these quiet moments of stillness that historically people of faith have tried to find and connect to God. But that connecting to God is not always easy and it's not always successful. And today I'm going to be talking about those times when we don't succeed in finding God. We feel that God is distant from us and hard to find, and even as much as we're silent and still and looking, God just feels disappointingly not present. This is a rather common experience among human beings. I've heard it from many people who are talking to me about their own faith. I've heard it from friends who've left the church. I've heard it from myself. For many of us, the felt experience of God's absence or at least distance is pretty common, maybe more common than the felt experience of God's presence. And we're not alone in this. The Bible is literally full of stories of people struggling to connect to God, to feel God in their lives when it feels like the world's crashing down around them. People struggling to follow God when there's so many other things that are interesting and vying for their attention. Story after story in both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament talk about people losing God and slowly, often arduously, finding their way back. And so the verses that I'm going to read today, here in a couple minutes, were written to a people who were in that very position. People who had found themselves increasingly distant from God, confused about what God wanted them to do, just at a loss as to how to live and do this faith thing in a way that makes sense. And so the verses specifically come from the first letter to the Corinthians. So this is a letter that the Apostle Paul wrote to the Corinthian church a few decades after Jesus was crucified, somewhere around 50 CE in the first century. And they were written by Paul to the church in Corinth on the occasion of a real crisis there. This church was plagued by some really bitter infighting among the people about how to live morally. They were arguing over all sorts of things, like whether it was okay for them to eat meat sacrificed to idols. This was an issue because some people were saying we're under grace and thus we can do what we want and it will be okay. And that's true. That's a good argument. But then some people were saying we should hold off on eating that meat because when we save it, it's actually given to the poor people in our city so that they have access to good food for that period of time. And our holding off is beneficial for the community. And so and then the people who are saying, we're under grace, were saying, well, okay, then you're forgetting about grace and you're making this about like being a good person. And that's not why God loves you. And they just got all confused and convoluted and got really busy arguing about all of this. They were also arguing about whether they could sue each other in a court if one Christian in this church did something wrong to somebody else, whether it would be okay for them to sue that person in a secular court or if they needed to work it out on their own. And there was good arguments on both sides of this. But at the end of the day, what this infighting and arguing was creating was a situation where the people were feeling more and more distant from God because they were so busy thinking and arguing, but also they were getting really confused about, like, what does God even want? Like, this person says this person says this. What am I supposed to do? And so they were actually really on the brink of a crisis and the split or even end of this church. And so Paul, who founded the church some years earlier, decides that he's going to write them a really long letter addressing these issues of infighting. I'm just going to read a small part of the letter, of course. It's 2 books of the Bible, but before I read it, I want to offer like a little trigger warning almost about the specific section I'm going to read. It specifically talks about forbidding fornication and not having sex with prostitutes, which was another issue in this church. That I'm not really going to get into the literal history of that, but anyways, I want the trigger warning context note to be that this passage has been often interpreted really literally and to detrimental effect. It's been key in the purity culture that dominates a lot of Christianity today, the culture that has shamed sex and sexuality, especially queer sex in particular, but really all forms of sex, and as a result has alienated so many people from the gifts that our bodies actually are. So I just want to name that this passage has done that, and that has been harmful. It's also contributed to violence against sex workers, I think, in various ways. So I want to own that, and before we get into it, like, kind of warn you that's going to be in there, and then ask that if you can stick with me through reading it, and kind of just pay attention to it as best as you can. I think there's a way for us to read this passage that might not actually be about alienating us from our bodies and our sexuality really at all, but about showing us how our bodies can really connect us to God, maybe when God feels extremely absent, and point out like deep truths to us if we're willing to listen and do some work to get there. So I'm going to read the passage, then we'll get into that. Here we go. It's from 1 Corinthians 6, 12 through 20. All things are lawful for me, but not all things are beneficial. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be dominated by anything. Food is meant for the stomach and the stomach for food, and God will destroy both one and the other. The body is not meant for fornication, but for the Lord, and the Lord for the body. And God raised the Lord and will also raise us by his power. Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ? Should I therefore take the members of Christ and make them members with a prostitute? Never. Do you not know that whoever is united to a prostitute becomes one body with her? For it is said, the two shall be one flesh. But anyone united to the Lord becomes one spirit with him. Shun fornication. Every sin that a person commits is outside the body, but the fornicator sins against the body itself. Or do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within you, which you have from God, and that you are not your own? For you were bought with a price. Therefore, glorify God in your body. Phew. All right, so there's a lot of words in there. But amid all of those words and the sort of complex sentences, do you hear the kind of force of the message? Do you hear that Paul's essentially calling out the Corinthians for getting focused on all sorts of things that kind of don't matter? They're arguing, paying attention to what this person is saying and what this person is saying, and getting lost in all of that, to the point that they're starting to forget the most basic truth of their Christian faith, the truth that God lives with them in their bodies because they follow in the tradition of Jesus Christ, the incarnation of God in this world. And they're forgetting that, and as a result, they're getting really confused and getting really lost and losing touch with the most beautiful, good, true thing in this world, which is the access that they always have in each and every moment to God's presence, which is as intimate and close to us as our breath. Kind of like yoga teachers talk about, like knowing our breath is like somehow knowing the deep truth. Like, I kind of think Paul's on that wavelength here. But that message might be easily missed amid all the words. So we're going to tackle maybe one of the most difficult words in this passage here right out the gate. And what word would that be? Well, it's fornication. Preaching on fornication. But what is going on with this whole fornication thing in this text? Well, if we look at the literary kind of historical context in which this passage was written, this time when Paul was writing, then we'll come to know through a little bit of research that within the Jewish tradition, there was an established way that fornication was used as, the word fornication was used as a metaphor for idolatry. So in the various writings of Jewish people, there was a major concern for Jewish people paying attention to gods, worshiping gods who were not the God of Abraham. And when authors would write about this, they would say, like, you're fornicating with so-and-so God. And ultimately what that would be is a form of idolatry. You're treating something as God that should not be treated as God. And so we don't spend a lot of time today talking about idolatry in our culture. So it's useful for us to just kind of name what idolatry might look like. And it can be all sorts of things. It's a pretty like wide sweeping term. Idolatry can refer to taking an interest in something that kind of dominates our psyches and our spirits to the exclusion of, either to the exclusion of, or like of everything else, or more than it should. And so like we can idolize money, we can idolize power, we can idolize certainly sex, or our own ego and reputation and desire for social advancement. Even things like good things are idols too, like wanting to know a lot. Our knowledge and our intellect can become an idol. Our legitimate desire for safety and comfort, if it's not balanced by other interests, can become an idol. A nation can certainly be an idol, and unfortunately, we're suffering the consequences of that today. Race can be an idol. Even morality can be an idol if somebody becomes so obsessed with like being good and right that they forget God is the basis and the way to be good in this world. And so immediately, if we understand the metaphors that Paul is employing in this section about the connection between fornication and idolatry, this passage begins to open up a little bit. Remember, Paul is writing to a church that is so busy arguing over morality, trying to say the smartest thing, to, if they had social media at the time, probably like write the most and the smartest like take on these hot button issues. They're just getting so focused, hyper focused on being right and winning an argument that they're forgetting about God. And so he's writing this letter essentially to correct course. He's trying to say, you've forgotten about God. You've forgotten about the thing that brought you together as a church in the first place, and the thing that should like matter to you and be the most sustaining and liberating part of your own personal life, which is God. And he's saying, all right, let's correct course. Let's say no to these distracting things, these idols, and let's say yes instead to God. And so ultimately, Paul's message to the Corinthians is about setting boundaries. It's about saying no to the things that distract us from God so we can say yes to God. It's about shunning the things that are harmful to us, that are not beneficial to us, so that we can say yes to the things that are good and beneficial to us. So with that framework in mind, I wonder if we might already find ourselves at a moment where we could really fruitfully reflect on some of the idols that might be dominating our own lives today. I wonder if we might be able to ask ourselves questions like, Are the ways that I'm spending my time and energy actually beneficial for me and for other people? Or are they neutral to hurtful for myself and others? Or maybe ask ourselves questions like, are the choices that I'm making, the way that I'm spending my time, actually bringing me closer to God? Or are they creating more distance between me and God? These aren't easy questions to ask or find answers to, and it's not like the sort of um, question that you would just answer once and move on, but really like they're the sort of ongoing basis for meditation and reflection that we're always invited into through the life of faith, through the life of seeking God, because the human condition is one we're taught of sin, of separation from God, that we constantly have to be aware of and correct course for by taking account of what's happening critically and then course correcting back to God, back to the good. And so, through this process of reflection, of wondering what's working, what's beneficial, and what's not, I'm wondering if we might be able to discover just practical things that we could begin to kind of let go of in our lives that are not serving us, not serving our community, so that we can start saying yes to other things. In some sense, like this could be as practical as New Year's resolutions to um, spend less time on social media so that you can spend more time with your family. It can be deeper things. Deciding to commit to a daily prayer practice, even though like maybe sometimes God isn't showing up, it doesn't even feel present, but like carving out a few minutes in your day to say no to all your commitments, say no to all of the voices that are running in your head, kind of silence those things and see maybe if God will show up in like a new way through that intentional time of saying no to all these things and yes to God. Certainly, this process of setting boundaries applies both personally and societally. It could include things like setting boundaries with a family member who's repeatedly creating unsafe and unhealthy situations. The truth is, by setting those boundaries and interrupting the cycle of harm that occurs when we're not holding people to account or even holding ourselves to account by like naming what we'll tolerate and what we won't, those cycles of harm just continue. But by setting a boundary, shunning certain things, certain behaviors, refusing to tolerate them, we're actually creating the possibility for change and transformation. It's very much this kind of truth that like Paul is pointing us to in this section, that by saying no to certain things, we're creating very literally the opportunity to say yes to other things. So personal example again was family, but thinking about the insurrection that happened at the Capitol a week and a half ago, I think this like framework is just as applicable. I think it's undeniable that things got as bad as they did last Wednesday because we have refused as a country to strongly hold elected officials and Fox News and Donald Trump to account for the lies that they've been telling for years. And just as we've failed to fully rid ourselves as a nation of our ongoing love affair with white supremacy, the truth is, until we fully reject those things as idols, until we shun them and say no to them, we're going to find ourselves doing real harm and violence to people of color. And ultimately, even if we have white skin ourselves, to ourselves, we're going to be compromising on the values that so many of us have to equality, to dignity, to respect for other people. We have to say no to these things before we can fully say yes to an alternative. And so as we kind of like meditate on that, the good news here and really the promise that's present is that the more that we pair this saying no with an intentional practice of saying yes to something else, saying yes to God, the more good things are actually like going to show up in our life, the more space there will be for them. This is something that we talk about in our abolition group every single meeting. We're learning that saying no to prisons, no to police, abolishing those systems of domination is only half of the process. The other half of it is finding ways to fully say yes to and embody alternative systems of justice, of public safety, of violence prevention and reconciliation after conflict. And we can't just do one or the other, right? Like in our rejecting of the prison system, we still need ways to keep people accountable and have consequences for harm that is caused. But that sort of like consequences is never just the end point. The end point is always the moment of transformation towards true justice. And so ultimately, as we reflect on this passage, ultimately, as we go into this new year, where many of us are trying to think about what do I want to change in my life so that I have more goodness, more love, more possibility in my life, I hope that we can get pretty serious about identifying the idols in our lives, the distractions that we have from what's good and godly, so that we can begin to say yes to God. And so just before I close, I want to sound kind of like a note of caution about this whole framework of rejecting idols. And in particular, that this work should be self-reflective and focused on our own accountability and power. One of the greatest mistakes and violences that Christians have engaged in over the course of our history has been to declare ourselves the referees of truth and right and good in the world. For examples of this, we can look as far back to the Crusades and as recently, again, to the attempted coup that happened a few weeks ago. When Christians position ourselves as already knowing what's like good and right and true in this world, when we think of ourselves as having the stamp of approval from God already, and we can call out other people's idolatry without listening really and like intentionally and self-critically for how God is course correcting us and our own souls, then we're going to undoubtedly do more harm and violence in this world. And so that's, again, like why this message from Paul, I think, is really important for each of us personally to grapple with. Like it is an individual call for every human being to get really serious about hearing from God about what we could do better, about the ways that maybe our immediate inclinations, our immediate desire to respond to certain situations and unwise and violent ways, like, is not really of God. It can become an idol of itself. And so as we do this work of thinking through idolatry, of really the ongoing work of like transformation, let us remember that that really does begin with us. And the more that we engage in that practice intentionally, the more that we heal and are open to God's transformation in our own lives, the more the world will change around us. And so my prayer for each of us, my prayer for this community, is that we engage this really seriously in the process of self-reflection, of listening to the ways that God is inviting us away from things that are not beneficial for us, not healthy for our society, not healthy for others, and giving us the power and the strength to say a strong no to those things so that we can start saying and enacting through our lives, through our decisions, through our resources, a world, a life that is just, beautiful, good, and of God. Amen.
Kathy wants a little of my time. 6 cylinders underneath the hood, crashing and kicking. I listen to the engine whine. I am gonna make it through this year if it kills me. I am gonna make it through this year if it kills me. I played video games in a drunken haze. I was 17 years young. Hurt my knuckles punching the machines. The taste of scotch rich on my tongue. And then Kathy showed up and we hung out, trading swigs from the bottle, all bitter and clean, mocking eyes, holding hands, twin high maintenance machines. I am gonna make it through this year if it kills me. I am gonna make it through this year if it kills me. I drove home in the California dusk. I could feel the alcohol inside of me picture the look on my stepfather's face, ready for the bad things to come. My downshifted as I pulled into the driveway, the motor screaming out second gear. The scene ends badly, as you might imagine, in a cavalcade of anger and fear. Well, there will be feasting and dancing in Jerusalem next year. I am gonna make it through this year if it kills me. I am gonna make